Okay, we're live, and I've got these guys here with me, and we are continuing our discussion on the Peterson-Harris debate. This is our third one. Usually we have something like dozens that I'll watch on Facebook and hundreds overall through that and YouTube, which isn't a big deal, but it's not nothing. So we want to keep that in mind. And where we left off last week, we were starting to get on the topic of education, and we were also looking at ways to sort of resolve the debate, because they didn't actually really resolve their debate. They just kind of danced around issues that they maybe kind of agreed on, maybe kind of didn't, slash couldn't come to the same language, or were so we might get into some of that. But if we can try to somewhat resolve it, that's one of the goals. I put up some questions that we might get into. This week we have Calvin, who's on the move, and we have Devin, who's new. Also Jesse Rogers, who originally started this, but he was unavailable last time. So hopefully we can hear from those guys a little bit more. What I'll do first off is just give people like about a minute to briefly introduce themselves, and within like about a minute or two say a little bit about their position and what they might hope to accomplish today, and then we'll see what happens. Milo, you go first real quick, and then we'll just take it from there.
Okay, my name's Milo. I've come to this with a background of all sorts. I grew up in a Baptist church. I had a mystical experience. Then I went to but then I lost my faith, because the church that I was in, nothing really matched up. And then I got into Hinduism and theosophy and a lot of other things. And then I ended up finding the Orthodox Church, which I like quite a bit. And but I come to this kind of from a Jungian standpoint, and I love Carl Jung, and I love Jordan Peterson. And I think that those two are the strongest influences in this conversation for me. And I like to see bridges being built, and people being able to come together and being able to talk about, from different perspectives. And I look forward to challenging myself in this kind of thing.
Okay, Jonathan, tell us some stuff.
All the stuff, right?
Yeah, all the stuff.
So my background is in academia.
Okay.
I have a big background in math and science, and I was also raised in a somewhat fundamentalist home, Church of God. And I think the story Milo just sort of laid out is really reproducible to most of us. I left, and I think I think what's interesting is we all have similar backgrounds, but the degree to which we left religion or are still interested in the mystical or the archetypical things that are sort of the baby in the bathwater, I think that variable is sort of different for each of us. And my interest wasn't very high until I got into this whole Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris thing. And I definitely come from the Sam Harris side of things, but in this debate particularly, I think Brett Weinstein was the real champion in many ways. So I'm interested in figuring out the languages by which we explicate our ideas. Often probably are the root source of our disagreements. So Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris had this problem with language, especially at the beginning. And I think Weinstein made a really good attempt to bridge those two languages so that you can talk about their ideas sort of in the same plane. So that was one of the things I took away from their debates.
Okay, Devin, tell us some stuff.
Alrighty, my name's Devin. I don't know what I want to say while I'm live, accountable to the entirety of the internet, but I was under the impression we're discussing number 4, which seems to be the same as number 3 in Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris's discussions. It seems to me like there was points where both of them weren't really trying to touch real issues, and they were trying to dunk on each other, especially Sam Harris trying to point to Peterson, saying that the way that he talks about, theology makes it okay for fundamentalists to just be fundamentalists, and there's nothing about Peterson's, talks about any of the theologies that make it fundamentalist. In fact, I was an audio engineer at a bigger, more fundamental, more what's it called, non-denominational church here in DFW. It has local FM radio play, stuff like that. They stream to tens of thousands of people, each service. And it was literally 2 weeks after I mentioned that I'd been reading Nietzsche, and several months after I had been mentioning Jordan Peterson to my pastor, my boss, that 2 weeks after that, I was let go and stuff like that. Wow. So yeah. And there was other parts of my conduct and the general how things were flowing with, stuff at, that place at that time. But that, doesn't really matter about, my job or anything like that. But it's definitely what Jordan Peterson is trying to do with the theologies is not what any of the fundamental type people that I've ever encountered that they would want to mess with or admit to or anything like that. So I'm hoping we can talk more about, more the way that I watch Jordan Peterson's lectures, and I've been through a lot of them, not just the debate with Sam Harris. There's a lot of fundamental claims that he won't make that because he's a professor and legitimate out in public, that I'm not a professor. I don't have too much of a reputation to worry about. So I would like to maybe try to make some more radical claims about this stuff and see what I can stir up with the opinions of these, fine people that I'm in this conversation with today. So
cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Calvin, you got anything to add and tell us what you're doing there in that vehicle?
So I'm Calvin. I'm a truck driver, so I'm actually driving through Philadelphia. I was raised Mennonite, left the church in my early 20s when I got this basically biblical literalism became a problem to me. Then I went, like most people do, hardcore atheist, skeptic movement, the whole 9 yards. In the meantime, I started reading Nietzsche, a little bit of Campbell, a little bit of Young, and then Jordan Peterson came along, and he helped open my eyes, along with the, background, but using those people, he opened my eyes to where you could go with taking a more non-literal approach to mythology that was useful to well-being and to life. And I realized that it was like this emotion, this part of me that I had turned off, that I missed. So through that, it's done a lot of benefit to my life. I'm also a big Sam Harris fan from my days. So it's not I have to echo Jonathan saying that Brett Weinstein was really the champion. I was rooting for both guys because both are heroes of mine.
All right. That's it. Okay. Jesse, you want to say a couple things, and then we'll get going in just a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say thank you for keeping this going, Isaac, and thank you guys for all participating in this, because this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a really long time, and I hate that I missed it last time, but glad to be here. And I had I had grown up as a Jehovah's Witness, and like many of you, I rejected the fundamentalist, literalist interpretations that I had received, and I did that when I was about 14 or so. Became a pretty staunch atheist for most of my life after that, and then it was around maybe 2012 or so that I finally came across Sam Harris, and listening to his debates and listening to his perspectives kind of gave me some grounding in being able to articulate what it was that I was thinking and feeling, and what my objections really were. Because it was hard to put it into words. When I was telling my parents, this doesn't make any sense. And so he sort of gave me that vocabulary, and so I always appreciated that about Sam. But it wasn't until I saw his encounters with Jordan Peterson that I felt like Sam Harris had really met his match, and there had been sort of like you guys were saying, a non-literalist, more metaphorical interpretation of the Judeo-Christian tradition that Peterson put forward, that incorporated so many other elements like Jung and Nietzsche, that really made it absolutely fascinating. And so, like many of you, I sort of come at this from Harris's point of view originally, but I've come to have a great respect for Jordan Peterson as well, and I find his views really valuable. And I think that we're going to be talking about the intersection between their worldviews for a very long time, and using that to generate our own, I think, as well. And it's going to come out of conversations like this one, where we all sort of have this mind meld that produces something that no single one of us could. So I just think it's really cool to be part of this. I hope the people seeing this join up with their friends and do this as well. And it's a really good exercise.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like it's no matter what we do, or anybody like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris do, this is a conversation or a similar one that will continue probably for at least 100 or 200 years, maybe to some degree forever. But it's completely necessary, because these kind of ideas, at least I believe, are always rattling around in our head on some level, whether it's to some degree unconscious or conscious. And then I think what's really good about these type of talks is not everybody will even discuss politics or religion, especially this type of things where we're like somewhat debating a debate, and we're getting right to the meat of it as much as we can, and seeing if we can even come to a degree of resolution, or at least a better understanding, which I think is a very mature, even noble thing for us to all try to undertake, where we can somewhat put aside our prejudices, you might say, to where that we can hear from each other and really try to understand each other. I feel like we're at a interesting point in history like that, because I feel like now that we're just becoming more and more conscious of just the past, the history, all the different worldviews, with just having so many books at our fingertips and so much information at our fingertips, and being able to talk to people around the world just anytime like this almost. Like, I feel like this is almost like I don't know if I'd call it a civil responsibility, but maybe even a human responsibility, that we try to come to better understanding on things like this. I'll try to briefly kind of go through my background a little bit, since you guys did. And I'll bring it up too, because okay, so last year, or it was about a little over a year ago, I was exploring a lot of different, like, I want to know what everybody thinks and what's going on in the world, especially ideas that maybe I was less comfortable with in the past, things like that. And I was open to, like, hey, if I'm going, maybe I'll even transition, be any this or that religion, whatever, just open to anything. And one of the first things that I did is I got some books and audiobooks by Richard Dawkins, which maybe Sam Harris would have been a better place to start, because the tricky thing about both of them, but probably more so Dawkins, is he just like in the Harris Peterson debate, they almost right away get to the fact that dogma can be the bigger problem than the religion. And but then at least I felt like they're being more dogmatic in the process. And I'm gonna switch out somebody real quick and we'll figure it out as we go. So okay, hey Connor, so
Hey.
we just kind of did some, actually I'll do it another way, because where'd you go? He's away. So yeah, we'll just kind of play musical screens here as we go. Anyway, so we're just doing some like little intros of ourselves. And so anyway, so I felt like they were kind of being the atheist can be dogmatic too, and which partly brings back to the point that we want to get into this week, which is how to resolve it, which I believe is something of, like, everybody's a humanist. You almost don't get a choice in being a humanist, but it's a matter of what kind of humanist are you, and on what level you might say of abstraction. And then I guess to kind of like try to briefly go over my sort of religious and ideological background, since we somewhat did that. So the reason I brought up Dawkins too is because when I was reading his book, one of the things that sort of put me off was he has this big stance, and some of the others do too, that there's no such thing as a child Christian or a Christian child. And the reason that kind of like really put me off is because when I was raised in, I guess what you might call a mixed ideological family, which is probably more common these days among boomers and such, where probably both my parents were hippies, but my dad was an atheist, somewhat on the rational type. And then my mom was a Christian, but not, I don't know if I would say a fundamentalist, more of the spiritual type. And then when I got into that as a child, like 10, 11, 12 years old, and sometimes they weren't sure which way we should go, like if we should go to church or not, I was the one to kind of be like, hey, this is good for our family, let's go to church. Partly because my older siblings, well, really from my half siblings from my mom's first marriage, they were kind of going down the nihilistic path, and including some, drugs and even crime. Whereas then my younger siblings that were from my dad, we got into church at the time, which did give us a more moral footing in the world, especially as young people who are just trying to figure it out. Now, then a few years later, so I stayed in the church for a long time, to some degree still, but for a few years later, I got married to a Buddhist, which kind of made me a half a Buddhist. So I went to Buddhist temple for a few years, off and on between church and things. But I was interested in that anyway. It was funny too, because at my wedding, we had both a minister and a Buddhist monk. That marriage only lasted a few years, and it was over a couple years ago. But anyway, that's that whole thing. And as that kind of came to a close, really what I was trying to do, which is what we're trying to do, I think, in this discussion, which is to see that all these different sides, different religions, different backgrounds, including all the atheists and everything else, they all have their place, and the best thing is to try to figure out how to harmonize them. And so I'm gonna let Connor say something for a minute, and then we'll try to get into it. And I might bump in and out with Devin and some others because we've got 7 in the group, and we'll work with it. All right. So Connor, tell us a little bit about your background, and we haven't seen you for a little bit, so tell us what's up with you, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, this is probably my first podcast in I want to say maybe 2 months. You and I did one when this whole COVID thing started, and I think that was the last one that I was a part of. So it's cool to be here. I'm familiar with all of you. I'm friends with Jonathan, Calvin, Jesse, and Milo. It's my first time meeting you. It's nice to meet you. So for me, I actually come from a similar background as you, Isaac, except it was my dad who was the Christian and my mom who kind of was agnostic or maybe even leaning more towards the side of atheism. And, I was naturally religious when I was born. I really wanted to believe in God because I think the idea of death really freaked me out. And I definitely think there are a certain sect of people within religion who believe because it alleviates their death anxiety, as Freud postulated. And then I got older though, and I started exploring science, and it just didn't really make sense to me at the time. I just didn't have the philosophical substructure and the theological framework to reconcile what I knew about science with religion. And then, to kind of take us down a different road, I had a psychedelic experience that kind of made it hard to, it's funny because when I talk to people who have done psychedelics, we all understand the argument that it's a construct of the mind. It's a Jungian archetypal experience brought out into reality. But for those of us who have had the experience, it's hard to reconcile that because it's people report, I report that it was more real than any experience that I've had in this reality. So it's just difficult. I want to believe that it's just a construct of the mind at the same time because it's logical and it's rational, but it's difficult. So I became kind of a more spiritual person, maybe without the religion for a while. And eventually when my interest in religion was resparked, I realized that there was a whole buffet of nuance that you could approach religion with that I had just never even thought could be possible. And that was what got me interested in talking about theology and part of why I started the daily discussion. Although I think the impulse that started the daily discussion was more political, and it eventually became more religious as I was kind of going through more changes and more of my transformation and stuff like that. So, I certainly think that there's a certain aspect of religion that's dogmatic. I don't think anyone is denying that except for the fundamentalist. I think the fundamentalist is just as lost as the person who claims that we should just disregard everything that's produced by religion. But yeah, that's how I got here. That's why I'm interested in having these conversations. I really appreciate, Isaac, you hosting this because I'm just one of those guys, man. I just like to talk and I like to listen to what other people have to say. And that's just how I've always been. So thank you for having me, Isaac. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks for being here. And
no problem,
we missed you while you were kind of MIA in the COVID world and all that. But it's good to kind of start getting the gang back together, the band back together, and
feels nice.
see where it goes. I'll just say briefly here, and then we'll get into what we're planning to get into. The thing that I wanted to mention, well, one, I did have 1 or 2 experiences that I don't know if they'd be on the psychedelic level. I didn't do a lot of drugs in my life, but I had a couple experiences 2 or 3 years ago that were similar with some substances. I don't know if I'll go into those today because it's maybe a whole other show. But it's interesting, but also on that whole note of the religious experience, sort of like another state of consciousness. My background in religion before all this, and to some degree still is, but not exactly, was not so much of again, just like I said with my original background, I guess. Well, one, I'm always open and trying to see how everybody's, getting at ultimately the same values and the same goals, but also I was always more of the spiritual type, and in the background that I was originally from, it was more of the experiential type, which I don't think these guys really get into because it's so non-empirical to a large degree, or non-objective, or it might be intersubjective on some level, just like you and I can say we had similar religious experiences on some level, but it's not objective. So it's hard to get into, but Jordan Peterson will sometimes just say that it's a big deal that, you know, there are these deeper states of experience and consciousness and that they can't be denied. And on that note too, kind of the other thing with the whole religious background that I don't, or any religious background, I don't think Sam Harris and the atheist type really get to, is that it's often a transformative thing, not just like, wow, that felt great, you know, like getting drunk or getting high, but it'll usually completely change the way you look at the world. And then and that's a really big deal, because other than maybe some of the self-help kind of stuff or some weird rationality that doesn't always work, they don't have a lot, the rationalistic type don't have a lot that can help a person that wants to transform their life, that wants to like put their life back together for whatever reason. And the religious experience, not just the rationality behind it, but the deeper experience of it can really have that effect in ways that none else really can. So I don't know if you want to say anything on that, and then we'll get into what we're planning to get into.
Oh, well, yeah, I definitely agree that that psychedelics aren't always fun. You know, sometimes you meet your maker, and it's not always pleasant. One thing that I've been thinking about, and maybe you guys can give me your opinion on this. I've been thinking about this a lot. I used to make the claim that, and I still do, but maybe more with a little bit more nuance now, is I used to make the claim that all of our moral axioms are generated out of religion. And, you know, I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think that some of them certainly are, because if you look at different cultures who predicate themselves under different religious frameworks, they have different values and different things are considered immoral. But at the same time, there are some universals, right? Like, so just to give like a really basic, it's kind of like if you smelled rotten food, you know, instinctively, biologically, that just, it puts that disgust factor, it instills a disgust factor in you. It evokes that. So I think the same might be true when we see somebody getting murdered or we see someone stealing. It's really the nitty gritty morals that I think are generated out of religion. Like the stuff that you can't see cross culturally, if that makes sense. What do you guys think about that?
I would just say that it's like, maybe I'll swap out just because I think Devin had a point on this. And I'll just randomly do some swapping.
Nice to meet you, by the way, Devin.
Hey, it's great to meet you over video, at least, man. It's good to see you, for sure.
I don't know if you want to say anything about that briefly, Devin, before we try to tie that up and go down some of the other stuff we were planning to go down. For
sure. I think a clarification I want to make on the camera for everybody to see so that we're on the same page is, like, if you just say the word religion, it's like all of religion, like the physical sense too of like, even if you don't think of it as like you're believing in God specifically or a deity, that your religion is still like a repeated pattern that you do, or almost like a routine but deeper and stuff like that. And it could be on a personal level, and it could be on a bigger level of like how space works and stuff like that, if you wanted to extrapolate that out there, versus like religious belief, like whether or not you believe with your religion that you are worshiping God or a God or a set of gods or whatever and stuff like that. And then that's why I don't remember if I said it in the intro to live or backstage about what did I say? Theology specifically. I like it's the study of the religious belief. Just if I'm wrong, you guys tell me, because that's the way I see it. And honestly, like, I'm not, a professional in any of this. I'm an artist, man. Like, I get all my information from around here. So, but that's the point that I need to make sure that if that's what we're referring to and how we're going to refer it to for the rest of the things, so that we're not getting into little arguments about no, religion is this later on down in the talk.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the first step, I feel like, with any argument like this, is we should define what we think religion is and try to come closer to a synergization of what we all can maybe agree on.
And then before we even start talking about that, if we get in a disagreement on the definition of what we're talking about, so we can be on the same page without thinking we're on the same page and just responding to each other.
That's one of the bigger problems is the first, I mean, you can't disagree with a definition, really. I mean, one of the problems with the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson discussion is they were using different dictionaries.
Yes.
Like Sam Harris kept on saying, well, I don't hear a God that answers prayers and whatnot. And Jordan Peterson was like, that's not the game I'm playing. That's you can criticize the definition, but that's the definition he's playing with. So I guess it would be helpful first to get a dictionary set. So Connor, could you maybe elaborate what you mean by religion when you say all morality is sort of a derivative of religion? So what do you mean by religion?
Well, just as Devin said, by the way, I just want to preface by saying this, that I'm no expert. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a professor or anything like that. So, but for me, just because what it was that inculcated religion into my interests was an experience. I do believe that religion at the most fundamental level is an experience. And if you go to I feel like a broken record. I've said this so many times to you guys, but if you look at the etymology of the word religion, it means respect for the sacred. And so you think, okay, what is respect for the sacred? Well, it's a perceptual experience. It's a way of looking at things. It's a feeling, if you will. And I think at the root level, that's what it is. And then you can go beyond there and you can say, well, okay, there's the experience, and then there's a set of institutions that claim to be the gatekeepers of that experience. And they all try to invoke it in different ways. So like, music, art, architecture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And beyond that, maybe you could even say that it's a dogma too, because that's one thing that it is. It's just that I forget who said this, but I think it was actually Karl Marx who said religion is the opium of the masses. And my objection to that is that it's also 10,000 other things. That's what I would say.
And I would say on that note that it and this is sort of a point that Jordan Peterson makes often is that it was Karl Marx who said that, I believe, but anything can be the opioid of the masses. Sometimes I think Jordan Peterson made the point, well, if that's true, then I don't know if he said Marxism or socialism or communism,
politics.
He said that they are the methamphetamine of the masses, which can be true. But basically, anything can be that of the masses, which I think goes into a sort of Nietzschean idea, which was he purposefully avoid. I think all he would drink was water and maybe milk, but I think he would even avoid coffee, but definitely alcohol. And he said that people, even though he wanted people to kind of do what they want, he avoided that. And he said he avoided religion because it's sort of that effect where it can, what did Jung say? Maybe Milo knows, and I'll bring him back in here in a minute, but it's that the religion can protect you from the experience. It can kind of isolate you from the experience if you're not careful. And so, and a lot of times that's what happens with whether it's a dogma, an ideology, a belief system, and the analogy is good with substances, not like psychedelic substances, but like opioids or even alcohol, where if we really come in contact with the divine or have a religious experience, it's not all this like rainbows and unicorns stuff that people paint it out to be. It's something like whether you take it from the Bible. I don't know a lot about all the religious texts, but an experience with divinity is something that would just about literally scare the crap out of you. But the religious sort of dogma and the religious institutions, they can protect, they isolate themselves, they insulate themselves and the individual. But it's tough too, because when you say religion, or even if you say spirituality and try to break it down like somewhat like we're trying to do and what they were trying to do and or avoid, these words can have infinite almost meanings depending on their context and depending on who's using them. So like we might all kind of have a different background as far as these words. Of course, Sam and Jordan might have a different background. And then of course, if you go into each of these religious institutions, they'll probably tell you a whole different set of things. Somewhat trying to segue into what we were segueing from last week was, and I've been talking about this a lot in some posts in our discussion this week, is that I believe sort of the way to resolve a lot of this, and I want to try to get into this and then also tie it into education. I'm really saying the education thing. The reason education is important, particularly at the universities, and this is what Jordan Peterson gets into a lot. It's not just that it's important to like learn things. It's that the universities were originally to help people learn how to be better people, not just so they could get a job.
Right.
There was that aspect to it also, but at least that was the whole point of the humanities department.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the whole point of, that whole sector of it, especially that you would at least tie yourself meaningfully to history, figure out what you are and how you got here as a human being, and then figure out how to orient yourself to carrying that on, that legacy in a productive way for the world. But now, and this is kind of the point I was getting with education, and we'll see how much we can get into it today. But now it's like the educational system, at least on the public university level, for the most part, they want to push not liberal humanism, like liberal arts, or that each individual can be whatever that they want and find whatever that they want to believe, but they want to push either secular humanism or socialist humanism. Now, I bring that all to the point of this discussion because I feel like to at least a large degree, that's what could have resolved the debate there with Peterson and Harris, because basically and that's kind of what I've been talking about on our post and text this week, is that we're all humanists, but it's a matter of what kind of humanist that we are. And I feel like if they could come together on the idea that, okay, maybe I feel like they're both liberal humanists, both Sam and Jordan. And if they could agree on that, then they could say, okay, at least in the liberal humanist regard, that means we should have freedom of religion, and we should somewhat teach that in schools and found our nation on it like we did in the West. And then we can say, okay, we all have the freedom of religion, and so what are we going to do with that? And then we should refine those, since we're always going to have these religions, and we should better harmonize those. So yeah, that's kind of where we're trying to segue from last week to this week.
Yeah.
And I don't know who wants to take from there. I'm going to have to control it. Go
I just
ahead.
had a question, because I think that's a great point. I always, I've been thinking about questions that I want to ask my secularist friends. I got two here right now. So I was wondering, actually, what bothers you more about religion? Is it, if you had to choose, like let's create a dichotomy here, as if it's one or the other. Would you say that it's the institution's bastardization of the idea of trying to help people in a way that maybe isn't helpful? Or is it the fact that the experience of religion can't be quantified? Like, like the same way like a thought can't be quantified. I could say that I thought something, but you don't know for sure if I did. And there's no way for you to ever know for sure if I did. Just the same way that if I said I had an experience, you could never know for sure. What aspect bothers you the most, would I say? And I'd say, Jonathan, you might have an interesting view, because I think you told me one time that you had a religious experience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me preface that then. So, I still to this day sort of cringe at the thought that I used to be a fundamentalist. But I used to have religious experiences. I had several.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was under the impression that there was a real spirit there in the room talking to me. Like, it was as real as anything else. And, again, looking back on it, I sort of excuse it away as being, okay, well, there was confirmation bias, it was an emotional experience, so on and so forth. But I don't discredit the experience.
Okay.
I think the biggest problem with religion isn't the fact that people have experiences. People have amazing experiences. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This is in Buddhism and everything you can think of. I think the biggest problem with religion is the dogma and the fact that it tries to pass its... Jordan Peterson said something interesting. He said, let me see if I can get this right. It's not just that the fundamentalists believe in the literal, that their book is the literal word of the creator of the universe. It's that they think it's that, and they think their interpretation of that word is unerring.
Correct. I completely agree.
So I think that there are plenty. I still have Christian friends to this day. So what we can disagree on things like, well, okay, are there spirits? Are there ghosts? That's the existence of ghost is a physical ontological disagreement somebody could have. It has nothing to do with whether or not your hubris is so high, let's say, and you're so egomaniacal that you think that you can unerringly interpret something like the Bible and claim that your version of that, your interpretation of that, is the unambiguous interpretation. So it's the dogma that really gets under my skin. And I think Sam and Jordan agreed on that in their discussion. What
about you, Jesse? What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think dogma is the issue. But one thing about religion that was sort of going through my mind when we were talking about that is that when we're talking about it as respect for the sacred, you don't really have a choice but to make something sacred, right? In the sense of navigating your life, you're going to make something more important than another thing. I've been studying Aristotle's ethics with some of my Facebook group, and I think that is where the future of education is going, is independent study, just groups of people like us just talking about important things. And Aristotle's ethics is one of those things that in my group we've been going through, and there is a hierarchy of virtues and hierarchy of values, and it's pretty much unavoidable, because those things are going to come into conflict where you're trying to find a balance between being too rash and being too cowardly, and in between those is courage.
Right.
And so that was Aristotle's formulation. And but is courage a higher value or and a higher virtue, or is truth, or is tolerance, or is whichever one of these things that we might want to make it. And so I think Douglas Murray made this point where he was basically saying that we're seeing a lot of weird religions emerge right now that what we've had as the bedrock, the foundation of Western culture, is sort of crumbling, and it's on its descent, and we haven't really replaced it with something else yet. So we're seeing all these other things emerge that are just really weird. And so some of the stuff you see at colleges now, where tolerance is so extreme that it even tolerates the intolerant, right? And that causes a lot of problems. But that's, in a sense, a kind of a religion. It's an emergent religion in our own time. And I think we're seeing maybe some economic religions. The communists had their version of a religion. and dogma is always the problem. It's once you have a certainty that you have the truth, and it's no longer subject to question or to revision.
Yeah,
that,
I don't know if I buy the idea that economic ideologies are the same as economic religions. I guess
no.
Yeah.
Well, but Sam Harris makes this point too, that when we say the word religion, that's like saying the word sport. There's sports where it's golf and you're hitting a ball, and that's very, very different from Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is also a sport. So when we it really has to do with what you value and what you think the rules of reality are, and with the nature of reality.
It's almost like saying that if you had a communist nation and you took away all the dogma, eventually it would just become a republic, like a democratic republic like we have. If you remove the dogma, the pathology goes away automatically.
Yeah, can I say a few things?
Yeah, go ahead, Mel.
I think that the dogma, we all say that dogma is the issue, and maybe this is the way to look at things a little bit, because regardless, if you take, let's just say we define religion as a general, all-encompassing philosophy of life. Okay? However that is, that's your religion. That's how you put the world together in your life. How you organize it, the pattern in which you operate, that's your religion. Let's just say we go with that as an idea. Regardless, I think you put 1,000 random people into that category who share in that thing. You're going to have a certain percentage of people that are very literal, very simple. They're very,
yes.
And this is their point of security. So they hold on to these things very tightly. And it's not a religious problem, and it's not an atheist problem. It's a people problem.
Yes.
There you go. Human problem.
You take 10,000 people and you throw them into any worldview imaginable. You're going to have a percentage of them that are going to be dogmatic, and you can't change them. That's where they are at spiritually, and some will grow out of it, and some won't.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that. I think that it's wrong to say that it's a religious problem, because it's clearly a problem. It's a human problem, and I think if we start thinking of these things as human problems and not this is a religious problem, I think that's kind of I don't know, almost a stereotype that we have some bad experiences with that in religion, but I've been around outside of the religious world, and you find it everywhere. It's just so I kind of like, I think that a very good way to maybe think about this is that we're all on a journey. We all start somewhere.
Yeah.
And when something, when something grips us and it makes meaning out of our lives, before we've really grown into it, we tend to hold on to those things a little tighter than normal. And then with time and experience at that kind of level, or you could say, level of consciousness, until you get used to that world of consciousness, you hold on to things a little tighter than normal. And slowly you begin to get used to those things. And then you take a peek into the next level. Well, and I think that a respect for people's journey and for people's growth is very important. And not to necessarily demean somebody that takes things literally and concretely and who needs very easy to understand dogmas. I think that when you're 12 years old or you're 10 years old or you're 8, it's okay to have some concrete, simple.
It might guide you.
You need that at that age. And I don't think, I've gone through periods in my life where I detested my former life, and I hated the fact that I was kind of this way, and yeah, and it took me a while to kind of see, you know what, I need, that was just where I was at that time. And the more I could see that sometimes you can throw out the baby with the bathwater when you look back and you say, what an idiot I was. I can't believe I thought the way I thought. Well, there were other things that were good that were associated with that too. And,
yeah, so I think one thing that's important that we should always remind ourselves is that, like, okay, so we're us 6 or 7 people here right now, and we can all have these different points of view, but that's just kind of what we are in this little slice of time. So we could have, and we're able right now to have this discussion in a very, mature way. And I don't know if it'd be different with, people with more dogmatic type beliefs or whatever, but sometimes that'll change, and it's not like the person's values majorly changed, but it might be their perspective. Although usually what it is, it's a different perspective of how that they interact with the world of themselves and others. But Calvin was backstage, and I think he has a couple points to make on this, so I'll let him take it away, sort of. Calvin, are you there? Go ahead. Oh, you got unmute yourself if you didn't already. Here, it says you have to unmute yourself.
There you go.
There you go.
There you go.
Sorry about that. So I had a kind of a question. You were talking about language earlier. It sounds like we need to be really specific when we talk about whether it's religion we're referring to or organized religion, because that seems to be a real sticking point. I'm thinking of the text conversation earlier today, but the one gentleman was going on, and I think that his main hang-up is with organized religion. I'm not sure. And I'm not interested in promoting organized religion. Me either. Other than maybe as a social,
right,
institution, in a patriotic kind of a way. But that would be more like a civil religion, not in the sense of, we must follow the Pope or whatever. Like, hell no. I don't think any of us are on to that.
Right.
That was my first thing.
Yeah. Go ahead, Calvin. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. Yeah, well,
I was just going to say, I really like, Milo, that you brought in the word percentage when talking about people encapsulated who adhere to an ideology, because I think it would be disingenuous to put them all in the same group. So, like, take socialism, for example. I don't put the guy who says, I think socialism would be a good idea in the same category as the guy who thinks that we should kill all the capitalists to put socialism into practice. So I think the same can be said about religion. And that's one of the things that I think differentiates religion a little bit from these other ideologies, is that I think there's something there for everybody. I think there's something there for, like you said, the simple-minded who might need really concrete, literal ideas that they can predicate their lives around. And there's also something there for the more nuanced thinker who maybe wants to achieve enlightenment. So, no, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the point that you were willing to separate the people who adhere to one ideology. I think that's crucial, because we can't lump them all in the same category. It's just disingenuous. So that's all I got.
How do we escape the dichotomy between talking about religion and talking about dogma? Because if we're talking about dogma, some of the most dogmatic people I come across are either fundamentalist Christian or atheists.
Yeah.
That's true. And I see almost mirror images of each other pretty often. So obviously we all know dogma is a problem, but if we're talking about dogma, that's not a religious problem.
Right.
If we're talking about slavery, that's not a religious problem. If we're talking about
human
misogyny,
problem,
that's not a religious problem. So it's peeling apart what is religious problem and what are human problems. I think Milo talked about human problems maybe. That's just such a key point. And I feel like every time I'm talking to more secularists lately, it's like, oh, well, religion, blah, 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 slavery. And it's like, so what book written 3,500 years ago didn't have advice on how to be a good slave owner? I mean, that's like talking today and here's some advice for being a good boss. And, 3,000 years later, somebody's like, well, who needs bosses? You're moral, blah, blah, blah. How dare you be over someone? It's like trying to get the context of the time.
I don't know how to differentiate the two, but I will say that a place that I think we're all at here, and this is another add-on to Milo's point in the separating people into percentages is, well, yes, there's the person who, doesn't really believe it, or there's the person who believes it so tightly that they can't let go. There's also the person who looks at it and says, well, I'm not sure, but maybe I lean more towards that or lean slightly against that. And I think that's the best place you can be. It's like when we talk about politics, the best place to be is not the far right. It's not the far left. It can be somewhere slightly right of center or somewhere slightly left of center, but really the best place is in between those two goalposts, I think.
Can I say something real quick?
Go ahead.
Calvin, you mentioned what's the difference between how do you separate religion and dogma? There's probably maybe a question, I could maybe phrase it as a question that might get us to separate those two, which is, and I've been trying to ask this myself because I've been trying to figure this out ever since the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debate, which is, what would a religion look like if a religion existed that had no dogma in it, or as minimal dogma as could possibly have? What would be possible? What was it?
What was that?
Shamanism.
Oh,
and the reason I say that is because the whole practice, it's a religious practice. I mean, it's there's a ritual, there's community, there's an ideology that they all follow, but it's all predicated on an experiment or an experience that's pharmacologically induced that none of them can deny. So it's not like one of them is coming up with their own ideas of how it is. It's that, no, we're going to give you this large dose of this drug, and now you know what we all know, type thing. That would be the only example I could think of.
Well,
I'd like to ask a question back to you.
Go ahead.
What would a human look like that's free of dogma? I haven't met that guy yet.
Well, let me make a point on that, and we'll see if we can dig in a little bit. But I was making this point, I don't know, a couple hours ago when we were having some sort of like pre-chat to this, and Jeff and I were kind of bantering on it a bit. But and a lot of the reason that I got in this whole idea of the different types of humanism is because one of you, like any individual could say, I am a secular humanist, or you could even say that I'm a socialist humanist, but that might work and be fine. Or you could even call yourself a theist humanist, like there are Christian humanists and different things like that. So you could say, I'm this and that type of humanist, and it could be all well and good and fine to say that's what I am individually. I personally hold this belief of secularism for myself, perhaps that I would like to have with my family, somewhat immediate community, and maybe how I want to run my business. But then when I get onto the level of perhaps the state, of whatever level, state, national, global, then I believe, and this is to sort of answer that question just a minute ago of how do you be non-dogmatic? I could be dogmatic with myself if I want to say I will never ever drink, and that's like a personal dogma that I might want to have, or I might have some other personal dogmas. Oh, Jeff's in the comments, by the way, but it's different when you get onto the level outside of your immediate influence.
Do you guys think the world would be a better place if everybody adhered to the same philosophy, or do you think the world would be a better place if everybody, if we included all the people who adhere to different philosophies and they all got to throw their ideas into the global conversation, and then we consider all of them to make a nuanced opinion?
Well, we want them to have freedom, but just like our Constitution, this is the point I was making a couple hours ago, just like our nation was founded on, and some others are as well. We want them to have freedom of religion as long as it could be done safely, responsibly, and keeping the freedom of each individual intact as much as possible. So not just like throw their ideas out there, but it's like if somebody wants to explore shamanism, Christianity, Buddhism, any theistic or natural law religion, fine. And then it's kind of like a free market of ideas or worldviews, and we'll see where it goes.
So we agree that the world is better if everybody gets the choice to believe in different philosophies, and that we consider all of them before making a decision, or most of them, at least within a reasonable. That's why that's kind of why I just disagree with what Jeff is saying. I definitely respect Jeff; he's a very smart guy. But I was just saying that I think the world is better if we don't just have one philosophy that we adhere to, but we consider everybody's philosophy. And everybody, even if we're not talking about a notarized philosophy that you learn in education, just a philosophy that you generate yourself out of your own experiences. I think that's important.
Right.
I'd like to comment on what would something look like without dogma. I don't think if anything would look like much of anything without dogma. I mean, dogma is your core principles, your guiding things. I think where dogma looks like a problem is that certain percentage of people that have to hold on to things very tightly. And so they define things in a very literal way. And that particular group, and they're always going to be there, and they're going to be there in whatever philosophy of life you have. You're going to have a certain percentage of people that are going to hold on to things very concretely and very literally. And then you have people that will grow out of that, and then these things that you used to think of as literal principles or just divinely handed principles. Now, I think if you say, let's say, then you have let's say a religious experience, and you actually experience this thing. These stop looking like rules and dogmatically to you. Now all of a sudden they just kind of look like signposts. You're not attached to them the way you were before. They used to represent places in the journey in which you should not tread. They're dangerous. So and any system is going to say, here are the limits to our system or of our philosophy. It's no philosophy if you don't have definitions. And as soon as you define something, you set a limit. And as soon as you set a limit, then you have something that somebody can attach to very literally and very concretely and hold on to it for life. And you're going to have a certain percentage of people that do that with anything, any ideology, any. So I don't think you can ever really get away with it. But I think that you can emphasize, if we talk about them in such a way that, look, these are signposts, we're all on a journey. You talk about them in a different kind of way. You keep, because it's stunting one's growth to hold on to things too tightly.
And I'd like to bring things to present day reality. We're here at May 21st, 2020, in the middle of our pandemic somehow. But the reason I mention that is because I think that's to a large degree what's going on in our pandemic or fake pandemic world, whichever you want to call it. I know it's not completely either one.
It's a real pandemic. It's
it's real, but this gets to the point we're kind of on, which is, okay, we have viruses; those are real for sure. But then it's like, to what degree do we create other problems by avoiding viruses, which are real? Mm-hmm. So for sure, we can lock ourselves in our home and never go out, and that might even destroy the vast majority of viruses. Although we can't actually do all that in reality, but we can stay in our homes for a long time and interact with the world at a minimum. I can't, and which is part of the reason we do this, especially these last couple months, is to help with that sanity and everything. But some people put a dogma on either one. They'll put a dogma on, you must never go out of your house or you're a murderer. And some people put a dogma on the other side of it of, everybody needs to get back out or they're murdering each other in the economy. So it's the same kind of thing happens, whether it's some practical thing with how we interact in our day-to-day lives, or it's how we deal with the thought of death, how that we deal with the thought of somebody's religious experience, how we deal with all kinds of things. I mean, it could be anything, like the best way to predict the weather anything can become dogmatic, but At some
Right.
point, you have
Especially
to.
if you believe that your interpretation of something, like Jonathan made the point earlier, it's one thing to believe a certain set of stories, but it's another thing to claim that your interpretation of those stories is the end all be all. And what I was getting at too with Jeff's comment is what I was extrapolating. And Jeff, please correct me if I'm wrong. Is that you were saying that all religions are a philosophy, but not all philosophies are religion. And if the world is perfect, then we just have philosophies. And my only point was saying is that different people throughout the world adhere to different religions and different philosophies, and that we should consider all those, but we should also not hold too tight of a grip on them so that we can do what Isaac, you were just saying, is not add our own dogmas onto those ideas. And then that way we can get the raw, undistilled, the raw distilled form of those ideas before moving forward. That was the only point that I was making.
Yeah.
I suspect that philosophies harden into religions very often, and I can't necessarily prove this and think of examples readily off the top of my head, but it seems like
I see it can go both ways.
Right.
Yeah, it could. I don't think it only would have to go one way or the other. But like for example, with myself, I've become a big fan of Stoicism, and as a philosophy, I find it just tremendously useful. There's a lot of utility in Stoicism, but if I ever hold too fast to it, such that I become
a slave owner.
Well, I mean, yeah, potentially, I guess.
You lose your sense of humor or something like that because you're trying to adhere to this Stoic philosophy.
Yeah, you can take anything too far is the whole point. Even if it's a beneficial, valuable thing, you can take it too far, and it may not be adaptive in every context. I can imagine scenarios where, and I've even heard YouTubers that are very deep into Stoicism warning about this, where they've noticed that they're so accepting of whatever circumstances may arise that they fail to learn from them now, because they can accept whatever happens. And so when you have that kind of immunity to outcomes, there is a negative side effect of that, where you're no longer trying to steer towards better outcomes than the one you had yesterday, and so you keep repeating the same mistake. You can't really progress that way. So, but I think the answer to dogma can sometimes be faith, and I would say Sam is ironically a man of great faith. He has faith in reason, but he has faith.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't necessarily frame it this way, and he wouldn't like it being framed that way, but I think I've heard Jordan Peterson do so, and I think that's right. I think he does have tremendous faith in reason, human reason, and I also have a lot of faith, not necessarily in reason. I don't know that that's I have faith more in love, I would say, and in humanity.
I have a lot of faith in human creativity.
Yeah,
maybe more so than human logic, but both for sure.
There is a good quote from Firas Zahabi on a Joe Rogan podcast I was watching, where he claimed that science was a faith-based practice, because it's the faith that the future will behave like the past,
right?
Which is also a mirror of a lot of the more woke people's recent realizations that I've been seeing across social media, that your perceptions of your future are only based in your framework for the past, or however you wanted to say that and stuff like that. So.
And we need to constantly be updating anyway. Whatever our past has been, we need to constantly be updating. Like that was the problem with the Middle Ages or Dark Ages. Their ideologies might have been beneficial for them for maybe a generation or 2 or 3 generations at the most, but then their problem was that they didn't update like they should have after at least by 100 years. Same thing happened probably in Egypt, where they held basically the same ideology for thousands of years, and that was probably largely why their sort of empire fell, was that they weren't updating, but they needed constantly updating.
Jonathan, what's your opinion on that? As a scientist, someone who's actually practices empiricism, what's your thought on that?
So maybe 2 separate points. The first one was it's not faith in the same sense as many religious people use the word faith. So, for example, I have faith that if I throw a baseball in the air, it's going to fall. That's one way you could put it. But I don't have faith in that baseball for any dogmatic reasons. I have it because that's the only thing I've ever experienced. So there's some precedence. There's a precedent there for certain scientific faith versus the kind of faith you would see in certain fundamentalist religions. But that's sort of a definitional thing. Whenever you introduce a new word like faith, you sort of have to define it. But another point I wanted to make about science being faith, the present will behave like the past. I don't think that's quite right. So, for example, in cosmology, they're looking at whether or not the laws of physics behave the same way they did in the past as they do today. And one possibility is that the universe expanded so fast. This is called inflation in cosmology. Some of you might be familiar with this. One possibility is the universe expanded so fast that matter was separated from other pockets of matter. So what you would get is you would get certain local patches of the universe. So there would be one patch here, and there'd be sort of nothing in between. And the laws of physics in this sort of local set might be very, very different than the ones in here. And if they can vary spatially, then they can also vary temporally. And we have a good reason to think that whatever the laws of physics were, especially in the first couple of seconds, they were nothing like we see them today.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, it's not quite that, but there is something.
Well, who knows? Who knows how the laws of physics work in a far out pocket of space? We just don't. We're so limited in our purview that we just
right.
We only know what's for sure around us.
Right.
Within our own,
right.
Yeah.
And that makes it a little easier to forgive our ancestors who could not see the future coming and could not adapt to that change. I think we're finding ourselves in a very similar circumstance. Actually, as you guys all know, I think automation is going to be a very, very big deal going forward, more so than a lot of other people think. And so, for me, it comes down to that black swan event, where it's like there are things that you just cannot look to the past to inform you of what's going to happen next.
I mean, it's constantly updating, and sometimes I think too about we just really don't know. Like, not on the physical realm, we can theorize there can even be other universes crash into our universe at some point. We could, and also like at the center of our galaxy is, theoretically the origin of the Big Bang and everything. So at the center of our whole galaxy is that. But if you follow the logic of cause and effect, then there was this Big Bang, however many, I don't know what it is, 15 or so billion years ago. There's the one Big Bang that just happened. But that's just what we know inside this little, it could just be a little galaxy. In other words, there could have been other Big Bangs far, far away from our center of our galaxy
that could eat billions of our Big Bangs. There is other interdimensional possibilities that we don't even know about. In fact, a lot of the rational people, even Elon Musk famously will say, the most probable thing is that this is a simulation, and that probably will be a case one day in the future, which I think is an interestingly good point, because, okay, if we can't for sure say what our physical reality is, and I know we can say most of it is what it is and enough to count on the world being what it is and all that, but what we can count on are the games, the rules of the games we're going to play. So the rules of the games we're playing are, more than anything, it's like, sure, yeah, it matters, physical things, this and that, but ultimately what matters is what kind of a person you are, what kind of a human being you are, how you act and why you act that whichever way that you choose to act. And in all of that, if you're trying to become a better human being, how do you do so?
And to kind of wrap up this point, I try to make the point in our previous conversations on just on Facebook that a lot of what I try to do and figure out in our groups and our conversations is how that we can go through the whole world, go through life, whatever situation is, what, you know, like our diverse family backgrounds, educational backgrounds, religious backgrounds, whatever. Today we're all in America, but sometimes we have people from all around the world and everything else. So you can be in all these different situations in business or whatever, but how do you get the most out of it? And in terms of how do you act the best way, and how are you playing the best game, shooting up the hierarchy, which is a point I think we're trying to get to, but hadn't really yet. And how do we become the best human being that we can? And that is ultimately the game. It's the game of like what's going on inside of us. And I think it's ultimately what our goal is, and what we're reaching toward, and what both of these help in, the rationalistic side and the more metaphorical side. But I want to hear what you guys have to say about all that.
I think that the element of having the artistic side of the way that all of the philosophy that you can derive from theologies, even if they were derived from other philosophies, you know, like me and Mr. Rogers were talking about. I forget your first name. I'm sorry. You know, the philosophy could have come first, and then it dissolves into dogmatism. And then Connor said, no, maybe the opposite. Well, I would see that, you know, whichever one comes first, it does dissolve into the other, and then you can pull the other out, you know, infinitely to some degree, like in stuff. So I forget the rest of my point. but I that's what, you know, excuse me. But yes, for sure. Anybody else?
Well, I'll just say briefly on that, and then I'd like to hear from other people. But a lot of what we're trying to do in this whole life is we're trying to make conscious our unconscious values. So like Connor mentioned earlier a little bit about like, well, we might, whether it's on TV or not, it might gross us out to see someone get killed, even if it was a fake murder. And why is that? Or we might cringe at the idea of even like a fake dog getting stomped on, or you know, all these things. And why is that? So what it is we have these unconscious values that sometimes we have a hard time articulating, and we're trying to make them conscious. And then I feel like what happens as we're maturing is our value structure will be sorting itself out. And when the world was in a more religious state, maybe you could say dogmatic, it would try to tell you like, okay, here's the values you need to have, you know, here's like 7 virtues, 7 deadly sins, those kind of things. But now in our world that's more, we'll say liberal and capitalist, for easy terms to label it on, a lot of times what'll happen is initially when we're sort of young, in our 20s, we'll say, money will become one of the primary values, and maybe even good looks. And then over time, it's not like we'll say we should never have money usually, but those will lower on the value scale. And then other things will go towards the top, whether it's something transcendent or it's truth and love, which I think is where most value structures kind of unite, is something either transcendent and or like truth and love on top of that, which is I think where Jordan and Sam were agreeing on. But so anyway, whatever you guys want to say as far as
I remember my point about the.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I got a little bit of stage fright there, but
no problem.
The point about you know, the dogmas and the philosophies, however you wanted to look at them, they can be artistically represented in a way that you can see all of it at the same time, and depending on your mood and depending on who you are in the present moment. Just like how I was saying in our comment feed about smoking a doobie and looking at an album cover while you're listening to it. It's you can see all of the different ways you could go about it in that, which is why I think the updates to the dogmas are important, because those are the little details that people are missing to make their dogmas work like philosophies in some way. So, for that to be there and for somebody to understand all of this in some way and then put it together in a cohesive, representation, even if it's something shitty like, being a good slave owner to your slaves. And then, that as the absolute extremes of how that happens, you can extrapolate that down with better freedoms and, both ways, better freedoms for the slaves and less powers for the owners, but more morals and closer to the center of a good synergistic relationship of, just people mutually agreeing to do things, as opposed to being masters and slaves, the representation there, and for that to be a point of, of controversy in the future, or something completely relevant even further in the future whenever our society crumbles and, we have to resort to shit like that, hopefully not, then, there's always some way that the fact that we're still fighting about it now, whenever it's peacetime, and you don't have to worry about that. And it could survive because we talked about this, and whoever else survives talks about it later, and it still survives as a story. However many, anyways, it's a vehicle, and it's to some extent completely thought to be like that. I don't think we give our ancestors enough credit about how well they understood themselves and what's going to actually work, whether it was articulated or not. And then for us to be here with our technology and our better ways to articulate things, a couple of generations down, you're not going to know which way is up again, because you don't have the same enlightenments.
I think what's happened, and
the individual experience.
Right. And I completely agree, Devin. And I think what's happened is, and I'm really grateful for this, I think one of the things that's happened since we've kind of loosened our grip on fundamentalism is we've moved closer from an indoctrination, which is to teach by force, to more of an inculcation. I'm actually okay. Inculcation would be to teach by repetition.
Sure.
And I'm much more happy living in a society that inculcates ideas rather than indoctrinates ideas, because at least if a society is trying to inculcate a certain amount of ideas into you, at least you can refuse, because you're not being forced to adhere to those ideas. You're just being conditioned because people have looked at history and they've looked at what's happened and they've said, okay, well, these ideas are certainly good. We should reinforce them over a period of time, but you don't have to adhere to them.
Definitely. I have a very controversial thing to say about that too. I think with public schools, I've seen a few, things on, the places that I get my information, the, places that you shouldn't just rely on your information for, talking about how the public school system is laid out, as to breed factory working type people and stuff like that. And there's a lot of studies on the, a lot of documentation somewhere that I'm sure you can find, allegedly about, they designed these systems so that you can make people more patriotic and more adhering to your social structure that you're trying to teach and stuff like that, which is how the public schooling system kind of works. But at the same time, I think that is a poison of how they're using this effective structure, and not a problem with the effective structure itself, that I think is basically like inculcation. Like, you go to school every day, you learn your things that you need to learn, you have your eat, you are around all of everybody, the really beautiful and attractive preppy people, the people who are just here because they have to be here, and kind of glad that they're not here all the time anyway, and everybody in between. And you have to go through this every day, and you're training yourself in all of these valuable pursuits for society up until you're 18, and then you kind of do that for yourself.
Yeah.
If you got inculcated to do the wrong things and blow this off, or you're just too much taking, what they're feeding you and stuff like that, then you're going to be inculcated to something maybe that you don't want, maybe that you didn't realize. but
Yeah, but I think inculcation. I agree. But do you guys agree that inculcation is easier to come back from than indoctrination?
You can just inculcate your way out of it.
Yes.
I think of it kind of like a term like myelination, where you repeatedly practice something and it creates the pathways in your brain with myelin and stuff like that, so that you can execute them more in a flow state instead of a conscious state type thing.
Well, and let me say this too, that last week, part of where we left off, and this is kind of the transition I wanted to make about this point in the video anyway, was we barely started getting the idea of education. And I mentioned it a little bit, like about an hour ago, that education isn't just important for the idea of learning facts, but originally the idea of especially partly, high school and middle school, but also all of education, especially the universities, especially the humanities, were to help us learn how to be human beings, because all this stuff, it's not that easy to deal with. But if we learn how to think better and live better and be better humans in high school and university, ideally, then it's a better world. And Milo last week said he wanted to mention on that a little bit, and then also Jonathan and Jesse, Mr. Rogers, have some background in the education world at colleges, I believe. So I want to hear a little bit from them and see how that maybe education might help us fix all this, or at least not. We won't at least eliminate some of our problems.
In education, I think in America, anyhow, a lot of in these universities, more and more, you don't the principle of free speech, like we would all agree about. They don't respect that. There's these safe spaces. They're creating children who are immature. There's I think what we have is we have some insanity running the universities. They're not making better people that can. I mean, a good person is somebody that can deal with conflict. Right. You should teach a person how to deal with conflict, how to deal with people that disagree with you. Okay.
How to deal with someone that hurts your feelings.
Yeah, how to this is what adults do. And protecting college age people from ideas is just is insanity to me. Right. I mean, it's outright insanity, and I can't imagine, and so we're going to push people out into the world where they're going to like curl up in a ball when somebody says something that they don't, that oh my gosh, they said something about who I am, and then they get people all tied up into these little collective group identity crap. And to me, it's a mess.
Yeah.
And we're not creating better people. We're not, it's not doing its job right now.
And I'll just say briefly on that, and then I want to hear from Jesse and Jonathan, especially because they have that background more. But that my point on that was that there's these different kinds of humanism, and the ones we're talking about specifically, and this is where I brought it up, I think on Friday in the group, and we've had some talk online, was we should have liberal humanism, which says it's not saying that you should never be religious or that you never should be religious. It's saying you should figure it out for yourself. Although there's some debate on that terminology, but what we're getting is socialist humanism, and this is where that Jordan Peterson will often talk about postmodernist cultural Marxism getting into the universities, and it really does. Like I've looked at a lot of people's homework, and I have friends that'll tell me it's just all this woke terminology of just everything has to be ultra woke or you're some kind of an insane person. But I'd like to hear from Jonathan and Jesse on this.
be careful about looking at math homework. If
Yeah.
it's Common Core, it might not be as bad as you think. But in any case,
Okay.
yeah, I think we're all on the same page with regard to free speech and identity politics.
Yeah.
One thing I might segue on slightly is my background's in teaching math at my university, and it's not fun because one of the things that schools don't do, especially in math, it's really bad in math and sciences. They don't teach you how to think; they teach you what to think.
Right.
And we need to start creating course design where the students discover on their own. The facts aren't just hammered into your head. And so, for example, one of the problems with math, I mean, some of you probably have had this experience, is, you know, some students even brag about this. They go, "Oh, I suck at math," you know, just like, you know, everybody else. You know, our society almost brags about not being good at math. How did we get in this state of affairs? It's like math is the language of the universe, right? So the problem, I think a lot of the problems that happen in multiple people is they had bad experiences learning math when they were in school. They had to do times tables and solve algebra instead of talking about, there's so many interesting things in math that are never mentioned in high school, never mentioned even sometimes in 2-year associate degree colleges, for instance. You never talk about things like Euler's formula or complex numbers. Complex numbers is even out of algebra classes right now, or at least it is in my university. So I think a big issue is science is not a bunch of facts. It's a way of thinking. And a good citizen, Isaac, like you were saying, a good human being is someone who knows how to think, not what to think.
Right.
Jonathan, I have a quick question. You know, you give a classroom a set of, and I'm just genuinely curious. You give a classroom an equation. And I think one of the hard parts about math is that if you do a good job, you get the same answer as everybody else, right? Like that's how you know you did the right thing. You got the same answer to the equation, which is the correct answer. So how do you create an environment where instead of just giving people the equation, hoping that they all come up with the same answer, that instead they come to think of the equation on their own without showing them where the equation lies?
Right. I think that there's a lot of ways you can go with that. Common Core's tried to figure some of this stuff out, and you know, to their credit, they've done some good, but a lot of it, people like to shit on Common Core because it looks weird. I think the problem, Lawrence Krauss brought this up. The question is more important than the answer.
Yeah.
So, especially in science. So, for example, let's say you're trying to solve a quadratic equation using completing the square. You do all the right steps, and then you accidentally, because you're human, miss a sign at the end. That should not matter at all to the fact that you understand how to solve a quadratic equation. Because the little sign error at the end, or you said, okay, what's 2 times 2? 6. Oh, that was a weird mistake. But you understand the process of how to think about it. That's more important than getting the right answer. And so that's one way to put it.
I absolutely love that, Jonathan. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. That's just brilliant. Yeah.
And the second thing I would say is discovery on your own. So there is a new course design coming out right now. God, I wish I had the right term. Math education, my wife will tell you, it's full of terminology and jargon that I don't know anything about. But the idea is you get them to discover things on their own instead of, you know, hammering it in their head. So one way to do that is to incentivize group work or incentivize self-study. So one of the things that we get people to do a lot is to solve problems in groups so that they can bounce ideas off each other, just like we're doing now. That's another thing you can implement.
Well, that's a good answer. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Yeah, I really love that idea. I think the ability to work in groups and the ability to solve problems, to identify questions and solve problems is really what we need to be training kids to do. And that's what we need to inculcate them with. And the challenge with inculcation is that it is a gentler thing than indoctrination, which also makes it a more enduring thing,
Right.
which also makes it, if you get the pieces of it wrong, they endure. The pieces that you've gotten wrong are hard to get rid of because they get inculcated. And that's what Jonathan was talking about when he's saying, instead of being taught how to think, we're being taught what to think. Those things are so deeply ingrained and so difficult to remove. And I think, well, I agree that Milo's identified some problems as far as the, woke culture and lack of emphasis on free speech and those kinds of things, and of being challenged by ideas. I think those are all important, and that universities, in some cases, I'm going to say not all cases, but in some cases, are failing to do that. Although there are a lot of good teachers out there that are challenging their students. So, I want to give credit for that.
So maybe it sounds like, more student-led curriculum, maybe with a little guidance from the professor.
I'm a huge fan of self-directed learning, which is autodidactism. Is that what it's called? I think that's another word for it.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're all doing now. That's what lifelong learners do. That's what people who become curious do, and that's what we want to instill. That's what we want to inculcate is curiosity, and just light that fire of them wanting to search out how things work and what's true. And then you don't have to worry about making sure that they've done it exactly the way that you want them to do it.
Right.
Not a way.
Yeah, but the problem is in public education, we make teachers tap dance around federal testing standards. So by the time they get to college, it's not so I'm curious. It's just I want to make sure I pass the test.
Right.
Yeah. It's all about political, and this is the part that I think is really if you dig down deep enough, I think has dug down to it when he talks about the embedded growth obligations. That's what's really messing up our entire system, because it is the expectation that if I do these things, then I'll get a professorship, or I'll get a teaching position, or I'll get you expect that the college education will give you advancement rather than it just developing you as a human being. It's become the pathway. It's become an expected pathway.
Well, just like as a writer, I'm still working on getting notarized as a writer. But one thing that I did notice is that the first thing you learn is that while you're in school, you're kind of adhering to an institution that wants you to write in a certain number of ways. But the best writers break the rules. The best writers color outside the lines, and so you want to push the limit instead of just making sure you're making this group of people who have decided that this is the way it's supposed to be happy.
Well, and I'll say on that point, you're right. But I think what school tries to teach you, or at least maybe at the university level, is what the rules are, because a lot of people, when they do what you're just talking about in art or writing, break the rules, so to speak. A lot of times they don't even know what rules they're breaking. They're just doing their stuff, but they need to know.
Good point.
So because then sometimes they'll do a certain thing, whether it's in their writing style or the way that they interact with the public, and it'll just be like, hey, dummy, you shouldn't do this or that because people are going to hate what you read or what you write. But if you know it, then you do it purposefully. Then that's all the better.
Yeah. When you get to art class, they have you draw pictures of fruit bowls, but nobody's ever become a famous artist by just drawing the fruit bowl exactly how it is.
Right. It's to learn form.
Right.
Same thing with writing. You learn the form so that you learn how people are going to expect to read in a certain sort of format. But then if you're going to break those rules, like Carl Jung, I think, is an example that a lot of us have read, where he breaks all those rules for the most part, and there's some others that might come to mind, but they know what rules that they're breaking, so they're still kind of in the way that the mind works, but you kind of got to go with them on a little journey to get to that same point, which I think works better a lot of the time, but I don't think it would work if most of those people didn't know what they're doing.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So the other thing on that, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm just kind of wondering here. We're dancing around the idea of curiosity. Is curiosity the cure for the dogma that we were talking about earlier? Because I think Jonathan asked an interesting question and Jeff brought up an interesting question about dogma. But the reason that dogma's never stuck to me the way it has to some people is because I'm incurably curious.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a connection there somewhere, because that's one of the things I also get frustrated by with the science fan types right now that are incurious about like this pandemic and stuff. They're incurious, and they're just spouting what they're being told, and it's like, well, these aren't necessarily conspiracy theories. These are places the curious mind would go. Why is this coincidence? Why
you could say the same thing about religion too. Like go to any pastor and then quote one of the most esoteric lines in the Bible, and then wait for them to give you that just canned answer, and then say, well, hey, here's another bunch of religions that also say the similar thing. How do you think it could also mean this? And just watch how quickly they shut you down. They don't want to go there. It's the same thing that you do when you maybe expand upon the consensus or something like that.
How do you make somebody curious when you're encountering a dogmatic point of view? Is that a worthwhile thing to explore? Because I don't know how to.
I would say on that I feel like everyone is curious on a large.
Born curious.
Yeah, we're born curious, but then to a large degree, and this is even how our brains work. Even our conscious and subconscious brain, they're mainly inhibiting each other. So, especially as you look at children, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they just want to get into everything because they're ultra curious. And every human being, even us like civilized, mature adults, we're actually always curious, but our brains are just inhibiting, like, hey, shut up for a minute or listen or whatever. Especially as we get into like a dogma or it might not even be a religious dogma. It could be a society dogma that's just like, okay, just do this because you need to have a job so you can safely arrive at death when you're 80 years old or whatever. There's all kinds of dogmas that'll inhibit your curiosity. But mainly what you need to do is not say, you need to be curious because everybody's curious. You need to inculcate people to awaken that curiosity that's within them. But I believe it's an organic thing that's trying to like climb out of everyone.
In a religious context, I think that you can overcome dogma by recognizing that there's a lot of depth in a text, that there's many layers of meaning in a text. Yeah. And then there's something deep that can be contemplated in a thing, and then that leaves the person curious. What am I missing? I must be missing something. There's more to this than I think there is, and then they meditate on it, and then new things. And this is, I think, where like parabolic thinking. Different narratives and stories that they have many different layers of meanings to them, and I think just simply recognizing that there's many layers of meanings to things that just that alone kind of draws you into thinking, maybe I've many times thought I understood something, and then I stopped thinking I understand anything much these days. I think there's something more out there that I'm still missing. So I think that there's a lot to be said. I think that at least in a when you have narrative and you have metaphors and you have parables, these types of things are very fitting to draw somebody deeper and to recognize that there's a lot of depth here, and and you can encourage, don't take it so literally, dude.
Right.
There's a lot of really good stuff in here.
That's always been my problem with the church is that, they claim like, oh, the Bible has all these revelations. And I agree, the Bible has many revelations. But they're like, oh, there's so much here. And then you go to them to get it, and they give you the most low resolution form.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
so much,
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more, guys. I'm
For
sorry,
sure.
I'm going to have to sign off here because of technical reasons. One little thing that I just wanted to mention was curiosity. I don't understand incurious people, but I'm also ADHD. And I often have thought that there's a connection between the inability to concentrate and curiosity. And I wonder if that's a missing thing that the educators don't understand, is that often the most curious kids are the most distractible.
I think it's the issue with the federal testing standards that make teachers, I think teachers want to create a juicy learning environment where they can make people curious. It's just that they only have 3 months to get the kids to pass the specific tests. So they have to allocate most of the time for that, and that's the issue, really.
And it depends on the classes too, and the teachers, and
it's on the short term. The same way that corporations are too focused on quarterly profits. In the same way schools are too focused on annual, percentage rankings and grades and things like that. And so, that's definitely what's killing the curiosity, unfortunately. And I think one of the things when Calvin was talking about curiosity being the cure of that, it looks like all you guys are frozen. Did I freeze?
I'm here.
We're all here.
Okay.
That was
I see it. Okay.
Let's do it again.
What was my thought here? So I think
Curiosity.
When it comes to curiosity, I do think that could be the way out. But I think one of the issues that, and Jeff kind of brought this up too, is that when people have their identities threatened, that they get really defensive. And so by if people have a very strong belief and that's at the core of their like axiomatic that's how they see themselves, and if they didn't believe that thing, then they that would be a threat to them, then that does get in the way. That inhibits curiosity, kind of like what Isaac was talking about. And so the way to break through that inhibition of curiosity, I think you have to be really, really aware of the danger of the ego and always be never directly confronting it. And I think that's where our interaction online, especially in social media, the problem with it, and I've experienced this so many times myself, the problem is that we get caught up in trying to prove ourselves right and impose through proof and evidence that this is the truth. Now you have to accept it.
Right. And I hope you mean by we all. I hope you mean like we all have done that before.
Yeah. It's just, I think that's just something that untrained conversationalists and negotiators do, right? And then, but
yes,
I've been reading and I've been talking about it every conversation I get. I read this book, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator.
Oh,
and it is so good. I'm gonna reread it very soon. It is so good because what he talks about is mirroring and like rephrasing things and saying it seems like rather than I think that, and so taking yourself out of the equation and just talking about the subject matter. So it's like and totally just disengaging your own ego from it and just being cool as a cucumber, and not getting drawn into the back and forth ego battle because you lose that way. Yeah. You can't.
Just a side note, you can learn a lot about negotiation for your own life by reading that book that Jesse put forward. I audibled it. It's a good book.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting thing how weak rationality is in convincing anybody of anything.
Oh yeah, for sure.
As a method of there's certain types of people it can work on in the right frame of mind, but very rarely, in my experience, can you reason anybody into anything.
Right.
Well, okay, so let's take that then to its conclusion. So
yeah, let's do it, John.
Because I mean, we should present evidence and reasons for what we believe and what we think the facts are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So should we try to make how should I phrase it? Should humans evolve to be more sensitive to evidence and less sensitive to the kind of confirmation bias and emotional argumentation that we see in, for example, politics? Because a lot of that could be solved because they don't even agree on what the facts are in politics.
I think we should grow stronger in that as well as the abstract and in the more extrapolated kinds of thinking.
There's always going to be both. There's going to be the literal, rational, and there's going to be like the symbolic, metaphorical ways to interpret and deal with each other.
Well, I think one of the ways to alleviate that, and not to quote Jordan Peterson, is you should assume the person you're talking to knows something you don't, and you should try to talk to them in such a way that you might be able to excavate what that is.
For sure. Right. Especially whenever Sam Harris was saying there's no way to misconstrue a goat, when especially in theologies, it's like there's so many ways to construe a goat, metaphorically. Like that's a
big one.
Yeah, that's the postmodern critique, is that there's an unlimited number of interpretations to any text, which is
but there's a finite amount of good ones, exactly. Ones that work, and the ones that work fucking work, man.
Well, let me take that to its point that maybe we can wrap up 2 or 3 sort of points we're on at the same time. I don't know if you guys saw it. I put it in the chat and on the group this quadrant of values that I sort of took off of the conclusion of Joseph Campbell's first book of his anthology, The Mask of God, Volume 1, which is one of the most important chapters I think anybody should read. I screenshotted it onto my group, so you can see it there. But what he does is he talks about how there are 4 fundamental drives, and that they're always competing with each other. So the first one is going to be sort of the physical and the body, which means we're going to always want food, shelter, and sex / procreation. Right. So then the second one gets into Adler / Nietzsche, which is the power and authority, which is it's almost an abstraction of the first to a large degree, because it's somewhat the dominance hierarchy and somewhat the growth hierarchy, but hierarchies in general, as far as power, authority, and as security as another one. Then the third one would be virtue or harmony with others, and how that we have our society. And this also has to deal with how I was saying a couple times, how you might say that you're a secularist for your own home, but not everybody has to be that way. So on the national level, you might want to believe in freedom of religion and such things. But now the fourth one that most people never get is that of transformation, because in all of this, like those 3 are constantly competing with each other, of the body and the power drives or authority, as well as how that culture can harmonize. But then inside of us through that whole time, we're transforming. And some of that you might call spiritual, what happens in spiritual religious experiences. And some of that is just the maturation process or individuation, as Jung puts it. But I think a lot of that ties into what we're on now, of these 4 things are always competing, but inside of all that, there's the transformative, and that's what makes it so complicated, is that there's at least 4 levels on every individual, and then we've got to harmonize those with the world at large. And what that's all doing too is figuring out how that we're going to act, and in the process of how we're going to act and live, how that we're going to do that in accordance with ourselves and others. And that will help us flesh out our innate value structure. And so that's life. And I'll kick it over to you guys on that point, and then we'll start to wrap it up.
And Jung was, I just read an article that he wrote, and it was on education, actually. And he said the most important thing is the character of the teacher. It says, that the character of the teacher is going to, is more important than absolutely everything in the success of the student. And so I think that, we just have to become better people. And as we become better people, then we're concerned about people, and you sincerely care for other people, and you want people to have the skills to deal with life. And from better people become better teachers. And that's all I have to say on that.
And I would say too, and I want to hear from you guys, other guys who wrap it up too on this education idea. A lot of it too isn't just how we deal with these facts, but it's how we deal with human conflict. And there's a lot of books and things like The Coddling of America, I believe, where they talk about how this generation coming up especially has been very coddled, and that a lot of the culture now will make sure that the kids almost never have to deal with conflict. And so then when they get out on their own, in where you guys will see them in the universities, it's not just a matter of how that they get to the same math equation, and if they miss a sign or whatever, it's how do they deal with that internally, and how do they deal with that on the human conflict around that with themselves, their classmates, and the teacher and everyone else. And which is really what we're trying to teach each other or learn in universities and everything else. But that, to our point that we've kind of been going off and back and forth, is that's what we're supposed to be learning in universities. And some do, but for large part, the universities are trying to just do more coddling and make sure nobody's ever offended.
Well, I don't know if that's still as true as it was in like maybe 2016, 2017. I think that was that was peak wokeness.
Oh yeah.
That's not wokeness though.
Good old times, right?
That's quote unquote wokeness.
That's great news. That's really great news to hear that.
I really don't see that as being as much of an issue as it has been. I think we've won, those of us who want to be able to talk about things without being deplatformed and protested if anyone is offended. Which of course, if there's 1,000 people there listening, one of them at least will be offended, right? No matter what we're talking about. So, we have to be able to talk about these things, and universities are the place that we've all sort of agreed upon as that's where it should be happening, if it happens anywhere.
Right.
But the fact that it wasn't happening there, one of the things that was good that came out of that is that we all sort of realized that we have a civic responsibility to do it. And so we're all teachers, whether or not that's what we're officially designated as or paid for, or whatever the case might be. The fact that we're having these conversations with each other, the fact that people are watching us have it, the fact that we're having it with people out in the regular world, the people we interact with, we're all being a little bit more Socratic now. I think we're coaching people through with questions in a way that provokes their curiosity, and we're getting better at it as we go. These are all skills that we are learning to develop, and the ability to communicate with each other in social media, for example. When I first started, I was the most intolerable SJW, like the worst.
You were a converted SJW. I knew we'd find one.
Before it was even a thing. I'm talking like 20 years ago. Like before it was even before they even had names for it, I was just the worst.
No, yeah, I can relate to that too. I mean, I remember when and I feel like this would be a beneficial practice for everybody, is just to, find something you're passionate about, record a video of you talking about it, and just post it online, because that's what I started doing. And when I did it originally, I got a ton of pushback and controversy, and it made me realize, like, excuse my language, but I realized I didn't know shit. And I've learned a lot since then, but I maintain the fact that I still don't know as much as I don't pretend to know more than the next guy. So I feel like if we lived in a society, and I'm glad to hear you say, Jesse, that we're starting to move past this, because I agree. I think
we still have a ways to go, though.
Still have a ways to go, but we're getting more to a place where we foster the ability for me to say what I believe, and then for you, that opens me up, because like, okay, say that I pick up a bad idea. So let's say a bad idea is inculcated into me from a young age, whether it's from my parents or from school or from society or what may have it. Well, it's a bad thing if I live in a society where I can never express that bad idea, because now I have to live with it for my whole life. But if I live in a place where I'm allowed to say that, and maybe a good close friend can say, hey, Connor, I know I get that you think that, but let me just explain to you why that's fundamentally wrong, or why I think that's a dangerous idea. And now I've opened myself up to have an alternative perspective offered to me, and I'm that much better as a person. So,
and I don't see enough of people being open to the kind of communication of the opposite, where they see somebody who has a problem and they're not open up. They don't know how to go up to tell them they have a problem in a way that's going to be constructive for them, and not just dogging on them, not just trying to dunk on them, make themselves look smart in the process, things like that. It's difficult whenever you have to deal with, the fact that what you think of other people's actions is more of a reflection of what you think is good or bad, and may not necessarily be what is actually good or bad. And, the trouble with the herd, not being the arbiter of truth, but like none of us actually know. But, if you can do that and be able to take criticism and give it in a way that can be, like benevolent and not just shitting on somebody, then that's where you want to be. That's more like that center thing where you're not just being a bully or being a master or something.
And I'll say, one, we're supposed to learn that in school, because it's natural for somebody to kind of be that way in their 20s, I would think. But hopefully in university, even if they're only there for a year or 2 or 3 years, they would learn to have better discourse with people, including themselves get terribly offended. But so that's one thing where, there's probably been some progress made the last couple of years, but we need to move away from like the socialist humanism to the more liberal humanism, which is how universities are supposed to be. But then also, I think what's really tough now, and this is where I feel like bipartisan, you might be one side or the other, but we can agree, like we mainly saw in our election process, 2016, where both sides were like, oh, deplorable, and they're both acting like bullies. Both sides, Hillary and Trump, where it's like they're not acting like we're trying to act now, and they're not acting like we're
they're just doing their own politics game that we have to, that we're indoctrinated and forced to be a part of at this point.
And it's encouraging the masses to be that way, which is unfortunate, and sometimes we can just laugh at it, but and I don't know if that's just the way that politics have to be, at least for a period of time, because if you're having mature conversations like this, it doesn't like play well in the political universe or whatever. I don't know, but it's a maturity thing.
that's how children, only on a playground. That's how children act, and it's a point of our immaturity at a cultural level. We're still immature, and you're going to see it again this cycle too. I hate to tell you.
Yeah, definitely.
We're not over it yet, so it's going to be a mess.
Maybe this is a good way to segue into this question. Is what you want to know. It's connected to the education, but we see our educational system reflected back at us in culture, in politics, and so here's a question. Just see what you can say about this. I'm not really sure what the answer should be, but what do you think we should do about the fake news phenomenon?
Stop
because
saying
it's a phenomenon.
No, I'm just kidding.
Right. Yeah, no, it is a serious problem. It's easier to flood the system with falsehoods than it is to shovel it out and repurify the well basically. So if the well is poisoned, it's a lot harder to clear the poison out. And so,
right.
So the media that is trying to untangle things with integrity, bless their hearts. It is not an easy task at all. And the people who are polluting the discourse will, for the foreseeable future, have the advantage, I think. It seems to be working very well.
I think partly it's a technology problem too. I mean, the way that we've monetized news has made it so that the most ragey, clickbaity article is the one that generates the most revenue. And even beyond that, I think the fact that mainstream media knows that they're dying makes them more likely to espouse radical ideas so that they can get the last few people that are just afraid and living in that fear space to pay attention to what they're saying.
Social media might be the reason.
Generally, smart people isn't where the money's at.
Yeah. Eventually. I think we're in a between phase. I think eventually we'll get to a place where technology transcends that, and hopefully, that's my hope.
Yeah, I actually think that the internet is they're kind of kicking networks' ass, and I think that I think like Connor said, they're in the death throes, and when an institution is in its death throes, it's the most violent.
Yes,
and I think that's what we're seeing with the media. The traditional media, let's say. But I kind of think that the competition on the internet for news, I think, that you're going to get some false people in there, but certain people are going to, show themselves as respectable, and they're going to get a following. And I think let the market determine. And I think that you'll find certain individuals or certain internet places that you can go where you feel like you're getting straight answers, and those people are going to succeed.
Yeah,
and the rest that aren't.
And people have to want the straight answers too.
Yeah. Well, I'll mention too, real quick, that there's a YouTube channel you guys might be familiar with called Rebel Wisdom. And he lately, one of the main commentators on there has been commentating on this exact thing that we're just talking about now. And the reason it's really important right now is because we're going through this transition where we're not looking to the media as our source for this type of truth, but we're starting to look to regular people like this, and we're starting to look to YouTube and all other places. But it's tricky because you've got some people like he's talking about Rose with London Real, who's gotten really almost to Alex Jones level lately, trying to be all in the 5G conspiracies and everything else. And the guys in Rebel Wisdom are trying to keep them accountable, which is important. Is they've got to kind of keep themselves accountable. Just like the mainstream media should be keeping themselves accountable, but not just the whole like, oh, no right, no left, no right, no left, liberal, conservative, but keep themselves accountable to what's reality. But I think, and I'll just want to hear from you guys, we'll start to wrap it up, but I think it comes down to we'll start to see truth for what it is and have better, bullshit detectors, the better our values are. So the better we start to see our values, because then we can even say things just like we automatically said right here. Well, a lot of it is because their supreme value is just money and what pays. So a lot of it's just turning into clickbait. So the better our values are, the better we'll be able to discern the.
Yeah, I don't believe for a second that Brian Rose even believes half of what David Icke says.
Yeah, he's just becoming a clickbait monster.
Well, I appreciate the role he plays in just saying, hey, let's just. If a technology company like YouTube is going to try to shut this guy down, let's at least hear what he has to say, even though we all civilized people can probably agree with most of what David Icke says is nonsense. But at least let's give him an opportunity, because and that's the problem with shutting people down is like you actually fuel the conspiracy theorists. When you remove somebody from YouTube for saying something radical, and now the conspiracy theorists are like, oh, they're removing him for a reason. It's because they don't want to hear what he has to say. But the truth of the matter is we be willing to, and this is kind of what Milo was saying earlier with the colleges, is we tell kids like, oh, you don't even need to hear this. Like if you want to leave the classroom because this is sensitive information, you can do this. That's kind of what we're doing with the media. And I actually think it would just be better if we let crazy people espouse their crazy ideas and let people decide for themselves what they think.
Yeah,
definitely.
The rebuttal is next to it.
Don't like what I did in backstage.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was saying put the rebuttal next to whatever craziness is being said, rather than shut down the crazy speech. So,
I think YouTube might be better, rather than like banning an Alex Jones, just have a little emoji with the brain popping out of his head over and over and over again in the bottom corner. This person's crazy, and just
Arthur over here.
You don't have to ban the guy. You just put a little emoji doing stupid shit in the bottom corner.
Right.
I think that I would be much happier, if they didn't ban people, because
I think there's a reason Joe Rogan is leaving YouTube, and I do believe it's because YouTube is trying to press him for some of his guests and some of what he says. And stuff like that, so.
Yeah, YouTube does not support free speech.
That fucking sucks.
It's real.
Well, the video will be on Spotify, which at least you can at least there's that. It'll still be free.
But I do understand, there are commercials that YouTube is trying to. Can you guys hear me?
I just heard a woman's voice in the background. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, I did too.
Oh, okay. It sounds like Isaac might have to get going. Maybe we should table.
Duty calls, Isaac. Duty calls.
Let's do another one.
Let's do another conversation. Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
would love to continue this conversation.
All right.
Yeah. So we'll
I'm not going to leave if we don't have to leave right now, though.
Okay, no. We'll get together, and I think I wanted to end it at about 2 hours anyway, so we'll get together in about a week. Sorry, I have a heckler in the audience, female heckler in the audience. Maybe she'll be on the stream next week.
I was waving hi to you earlier.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll get together in about a week. I wanted to mention too, we didn't get to this ontological contradiction that we had a little bit of discussion about. There's a YouTuber named That's BS, I guess, and we were going to try to get to that, but I was trying to get him on here today because we're talking on YouTube. Yeah. And he said he's not available today, but in the next couple of days I might have a little talk with him, and then hopefully in about a week we'll do this again and see where it goes. Maybe we'll get him in here.
He's got a great YouTube channel. We'll talk about
something real quick. Sorry, I know it's super weird. So I'm starting a new I'm done with the daily discussion. I'm starting a new podcast. It's going to be called The University of Polarity. And basically the goal of the podcast is going to be to break down both sides of every major argument and try to break down the extremes of each side and then also delineate a middle ground. And it's going to be on the same YouTube channel. I'm just going to change the name. The daily discussions will still be on there labeled as the daily discussion, but that's going to be my new podcast. So just want to put that cool.
You're looking for the synthesis.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah,
extreme, and then let's bring it right there. Yep.
Very cool.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up, and then we'll talk the next couple of days. So we did it Thursday afternoon the last couple of weeks, but if possible, I'd like to try to get some people in here that haven't been yet. And like I said, I'm going to see if I can organize with that one YouTuber called That's BS. And we'll hopefully get him in here, and we'll see where it goes. But I don't know if anybody else has anything you want to say before we peace out. But other than that, we're going to talk again in about a week.
Love you guys.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Great time.
Good to meet you all.
All right, cool, guys. It was fun to have each and every one of you and Calvin and everybody else. And this is... I forget the name of this YouTube Facebook user, but we'll get to some of this, and hopefully he might be in here next time. But anyway, Peace, love, and hearts, and
Oh, yeah.
rainbows and unicorns. And we'll see you guys in about a week. Thanks a lot.
Woo!
All right.
All right. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.